The first time Preston Doyle looked me in the eye, he laughed, put his hand on my wife's shoulder in front of me, and said, "She needs a real man, not a soft little accountant who cries during movies." I stood there in my own driveway, in the golden light of a Tuesday afternoon, and said nothing, because in that moment, I didn't trust myself to speak without breaking something. What none of them knew, not my wife, not her lover, not even my own daughter, was that 15 years earlier, before spreadsheets and mortgage payments and quiet Sunday mornings, I had bled, sweat, and nearly broken my body to earn a black belt in a discipline built entirely around restraint. This is the story of the day that restraint was tested, and the truth about what it really means to be a man. Before we go further, if you believe in kindness, in forgiveness, in second chances, and in the quiet hope that even our worst days can lead somewhere better, I want to ask you for something small. Please take a moment to like this video, leave a comment about a time your own patience was tested, share it with someone in our community who might need a little hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another story like this one. Our channel exists because of viewers like you, people who still believe that gentleness is not weakness, and that real strength often wears the quietest face in the room. Now, let me take you back to where it all began, long before that afternoon in the driveway, long before I ever imagined my marriage would be tested in front of my own child. My name is Callum Ashworth, and for most of my adult life, I was the kind of man nobody noticed in a crowded room. I was 41 years old when all of this happened, though I felt older some days and younger on others, depending on how the light hit the kitchen table where my wife and I used to eat breakfast together. I worked as a financial analyst for a mid-sized logistics company in a quiet suburb outside Portland, the kind of place where the biggest excitement of the week was a farmer's market on Saturday mornings and an occasional deer wandering into someone's backyard. I wore button-down shirts in muted colors, drove a sensible gray sedan, and carried a leather satchel instead of a briefcase because my daughter, Junie, had picked it out for me on my 38th birthday and I never had the heart to switch back. People who met me assumed, correctly in most ways, that I was unremarkable. I did not raise my voice. I did not seek attention. I preferred listening to talking, and when conflict arose, my instinct was always to de-escalate, to find the quiet path around the fire rather than walk through it. What almost no one knew, because I never spoke of it, was that between the ages of 19 and 31, I had trained obsessively in a discipline of Brazilian Jiu-Jitsu and boxing under a stern, soft-spoken instructor named Walt Corrigan, a man who had fought professionally in his youth and spent the second half of his life teaching young men how to control the violence inside themselves rather than unleash it. I earned my black belt after 12 years of training that included 2 broken fingers, a dislocated shoulder, a torn ACL that sidelined me for 8 months, and more mornings than I could count where I woke up too sore to lift a coffee cup without wincing. Walt used to say that the belt itself meant nothing, that the real achievement was learning to walk away from a fight you could easily win. I carried that lesson with me long after I stopped training regularly, long after marriage and fatherhood and the slow erosion of free time turned my old gym bag into a relic gathering dust in the garage. I still remembered every technique, every submission, every angle of leverage, but I had not sparred in nearly 9 years, and I told myself that part of my life was closed, a door I did not need to open again. I met my wife, Meredith, when I was 29, at a mutual friend's barbecue on a hot July afternoon. She was working as a pediatric nurse at the time, full of an energy and warmth that made everyone around her feel like the most interesting person in the room. She had a laugh that came from somewhere deep in her chest, unguarded and real, and I fell for her within the first 20 minutes of conversation, mostly because she was the first person in years who asked me questions about myself and actually waited to hear the answers. We married 2 years later in a small ceremony in her parents' backyard, under a maple tree that her father had planted the year she was born. For the first several years, our marriage was, by any honest measure, a happy one. We built a modest but comfortable life together. We had Junie when Meredith was 32, and I remember holding my daughter for the first time and feeling something inside me shift permanently, a sense that my life's purpose had quietly rearranged itself around this small, fierce, red-faced creature who gripped my finger like she was never going to let go. The trouble, when I look back on it honestly, did not arrive suddenly. It crept in slowly, the way water finds its way into a foundation crack by crack, invisible until the damage is already extensive. Meredith left nursing when Junie was 3, partly because the hours were brutal and partly because we agreed it made more sense for one of us to be home during those early years, and I was the one with the more stable income. She took on freelance medical transcription work from home, and for a while, that arrangement seemed to suit her fine. But somewhere around the time Junie started elementary school, I began to notice a restlessness in Meredith that hadn't been there before. She stopped talking as much about her days. She started scrolling her phone at dinner, laughing at something and then locking the screen quickly when I glanced over. She joined a gym, which I encouraged, genuinely happy she was finding something for herself again, until I realized she was going at odd hours, sometimes leaving before dawn and coming home flushed and distracted in a way that had nothing to do with exercise. I want to be honest about my own failures here, because this is not a story where I paint myself as a flawless victim. I withdrew during those years too. I buried myself in work, told myself that providing financially was enough, that showing love through stability and reliability could substitute for showing up emotionally in the ways Meredith actually needed. I stopped asking her questions the way I used to at that barbecue 15 years earlier. I let the comfortable rhythm of our marriage calcify into something closer to habit than intimacy. I am not proud of this, and in the months that followed everything that happened, I spent a great deal of time reckoning with the ways I had let my wife feel invisible long before another man ever noticed her. That other man was Preston Doyle, a personal trainer at the gym Meredith had joined, 11 years younger than her, with the kind of practiced charisma that comes from spending a career convincing strangers to trust him with their bodies and their insecurities. I did not know his name for the better part of a year. I only knew that my wife seemed happier in a way that unsettled me, a happiness that seemed to have nothing to do with our home, our daughter, or me. I told myself I was imagining things. I told myself that a woman in her mid-30s was allowed to feel good about herself without it being a threat to our marriage. I ignored the small warning signs the way people often do, not because I was foolish, but because the alternative, confronting the possibility that my marriage was quietly dissolving, felt too enormous to face. The truth came out on an ordinary Thursday afternoon in early spring, the kind of unremarkable day that later becomes permanently etched into memory simply because of what happened on it. I had left work early because of a dentist appointment that got cancelled, and instead of going back to the office, I decided to surprise Meredith by picking up Junie from school myself, something I rarely got to do. When I pulled into our driveway afterward, Junie chattering beside me about a science project involving baking soda volcanoes, I saw an unfamiliar black pickup truck parked at the curb in front of our house. I did not think much of it at first, assuming it belonged to a contractor or a neighbor's guest, until I walked through the front door and heard Meredith's voice from the kitchen, low and warm in a register I hadn't heard directed at me in longer than I wanted to admit, and a man's laugh answering hers. I told Junie to go upstairs and start her homework, keeping my own voice steady even as my pulse had already begun to hammer in my ears. When I walked into the kitchen, I found Meredith standing very close to a broad-shouldered man in a fitted gray t-shirt, his hand resting on the small of her back in a way that needed no explanation. They separated quickly when they saw me, Meredith's face draining of color, the stranger's expression shifting from surprise to something closer to defiance. That was the first time I saw Preston Doyle's face clearly, and I remember thinking, absurdly, that he looked exactly like the kind of man they cast in commercials for protein shakes. What followed in the weeks after that discovery was the most painful stretch of my adult life. Meredith did not deny it. To her credit, or perhaps simply because there was no point in lying once I had seen it with my own eyes, she admitted almost immediately that the relationship had been going on for nearly 7 months. She cried, she apologized, she told me she didn't know how it had happened, that it started as friendship and admiration and somewhere along the way became something else entirely, something she said she both regretted and could not fully make herself stop. I remember sitting at our kitchen table that night after Junie had finally fallen asleep, staring at the maplewood grain, feeling a grief so total it was almost physical, like something had been surgically removed from my chest without anesthesia. I want to pause here and say something to anyone watching who has experienced betrayal in a marriage or a relationship, because I know many of you have written about this in the comments of other stories on our channel. The pain of discovering infidelity is not simply about jealousy or wounded pride, though those things are certainly present. It is about the wholesale rewriting of your own memory. Every dinner, every ordinary Tuesday, every moment you believed you understood suddenly demands to be re-examined under a new and terrible light. I spent that first week barely sleeping, running conversations backward through my mind, searching for the exact moment the woman I married had started slipping away from me, and finding, painfully, that there was no single moment, only a slow accumulation of small neglects on both our parts that had left a door open just wide enough for someone else to walk through. I did not immediately decide whether to fight for my marriage or walk away from it. Meredith, to her credit, ended things with Preston within days of being discovered, or at least she told me she had, and for a while I believed her. We began seeing a marriage counselor, a calm, unflappable woman named Dr. Ferris who specialized in what she called betrayal trauma, and for nearly 2 months, I genuinely believed we were finding our way back to each other. Meredith seemed remorseful in a way that felt authentic rather than performative. She started asking me questions again the way she used to at that barbecue years earlier. She started leaving small notes in my satchel, the way she had when we were newly dating. I allowed myself, cautiously, to hope. But hope, I would learn, is not the same as certainty, and Preston Doyle was not a man accustomed to losing things he had decided he wanted. I found out later, through a mutual acquaintance at the gym, that he had continued texting Meredith throughout those 2 months, that he had shown up at the smoothie shop she frequented on her supposed solo mornings, that what I believed was a clean break had actually been a slow, deliberate campaign of re-entry disguised as coincidence. The second discovery, which came on a bright Saturday morning in early June when I found a string of messages on a tablet Meredith had forgotten to log out of, was in some ways more devastating than the first, because it meant the woman I loved had not simply made a mistake and corrected course. She had chosen, quietly and repeatedly, to keep a door open that she had promised me, and herself, she had closed. That was the day I finally told Meredith I needed time apart to think clearly, and she moved into her sister's house for what we both understood, without saying it directly, might become permanent. Junie stayed primarily with me during the week, which was its own quiet mercy, because caring for her gave my days a structure and a purpose that kept me from disappearing entirely into grief. I want to tell you that I handled those months with grace and wisdom, but the truth is messier than that. I had nights where I sat alone in our garage, staring at the dusty gym bag I hadn't touched in nearly a decade, feeling something old and dangerous stir in my chest, an anger I did not entirely recognize as my own. I had never been a violent man. Even in my years of intense training, Walt Corrigan had drilled into all of us that the discipline existed to make violence unnecessary, not to invite it. But grief has a way of digging up parts of yourself you thought you had buried for good. It was during this separation, roughly 6 weeks in, that the incident in the driveway occurred, the one I described at the very beginning of this story. Meredith had come by on a Saturday afternoon to pick up Junie for a weekend visit, something we had arranged carefully through Dr. Ferris's guidance to keep our daughter's routine as stable as possible. I did not expect Preston Doyle to be with her. I found out afterward that Meredith herself hadn't planned for him to come either, that he had simply shown up uninvited, insisting he wanted to meet Junie properly, an idea that Meredith, to her credit, had firmly rejected weeks earlier and thought she had made clear to him. But Preston was not a man who respected boundaries he hadn't personally drawn, and he pulled up in that same black pickup truck just as Meredith was getting out of her car, and before either of us could stop the moment from happening, he was standing in my driveway, in broad daylight, with his hand on my wife's shoulder, looking at me the way a man looks at something he considers beneath his notice. I remember the exact quality of the light that afternoon, the way early autumn sun slanted low and gold across our lawn, catching dust motes in the air, illuminating everything with an almost cruel gentleness given what was unfolding beneath it. Junie was inside packing her overnight bag, thankfully out of earshot for what came next. Preston looked me up and down, taking in my cardigan, my reading glasses pushed up into my hair, the general unremarkable softness of a man who spent his days behind a desk, and he laughed, that same laugh I'd later replay 100 times in my memory, and said the words that would define the rest of that day. He told me Meredith needed a real man, not someone soft, not someone who cried during movies, a detail he must have gotten from her in some intimate late-night conversation that made my stomach turn to think about. He said it with the casual cruelty of someone who has never once in his life feared consequences, because his body had always been his advantage, his most reliable currency in every room he ever walked into. I did not respond right away. Meredith, to her credit, immediately told him to stop, her face flushed with an embarrassment and anger of her own, telling him this was not why he had come and that he needed to leave. But Preston, emboldened perhaps by whatever cocktail of jealousy and ego was driving him that day, kept going. He said that a real man would fight for what was his, that if I had any actual respect for myself, I would settle this the way men used to settle things, with our fists, right there, right then. He said it loud enough that I saw the curtain in our neighbor's front window twitch, loud enough that I worried, with a jolt of real fear, that Junie might hear through the screen door and come running out to see what the commotion was about. In that moment, something in me went very still, the way I remembered feeling on the mats with Walt Corrigan all those years ago, right before an opponent moved, the strange clarity that comes when panic recedes and pure focus takes its place. I want to be honest with you about what I felt, because I think honesty matters more than heroism in a story like this. Part of me, a part one I'm not entirely proud of, wanted very badly to accept his challenge, to let 12 years of discipline finally answer for itself, to watch the arrogance drain out of his face the moment he realized what he was actually dealing with. I could see, with the clinical precision of old training resurfacing, every opening in his stance, the way he stood with his weight too far forward, the way his hands hung loose and untrained at his sides, a man who had spent years building muscle for aesthetic purposes rather than combat. I knew, with total certainty, that I could have ended any physical confrontation between us in under 15 seconds, and some small, wounded, humiliated part of me wanted exactly that. But I thought of Junie, just inside that screen door, and I thought of Walt Corrigan's voice, the one that had echoed through that drafty gym for 12 years of my youth, telling us that a black belt was not a permission slip for violence but a heavier obligation to avoid it. I thought about what it would mean for my daughter to watch her father, a man she had only ever known as gentle, suddenly transform into something else in the front yard of her own home. So instead of raising my fists, I did something that surprised everyone present, including myself. I laughed, quietly, not unkindly, and said that I wasn't going to fight him in my own driveway with my daughter 20 feet away, that whatever he needed to prove about his own manhood was not something I was interested in helping him prove, and that he needed to leave before I called the police for trespassing. Preston did not take this well. He stepped closer, close enough that I could smell the aggressive citrus of his cologne, and said that my refusal only confirmed what he already believed, that I was a coward hiding behind excuses, that Meredith had told him herself I had never once stood up for anything in my life. That last part landed harder than I expected, not because I believed it was true, but because it meant Meredith had, at some point in their relationship, spoken about me in ways that made this man feel entitled to humiliate me in front of my own home. I looked past Preston to Meredith, whose face had gone pale, and I asked her, quietly, if that was really what she thought of me. She started to cry and said no, that she had never said that Preston was twisting something she'd said in a moment of frustration months ago into something cruel and untrue. I believed her, mostly, though the sting of it did not fully fade for a long time afterward. What happened next is the part of this story I have thought about more than almost anything else in my life, because it became the hinge on which everything else turned. Preston, apparently unwilling to let the confrontation end without some kind of victory, shoved me, hard, both hands against my chest, hard enough that I stumbled back 2 steps into the flower bed along our front walk, crushing a row of Meredith's marigolds beneath my heel. Junie, it turned out, had heard the commotion after all, and she came running out onto the porch just in time to see her father stumble backward, her small face contorting with a fear I never wanted her to feel. She screamed my name, and that sound, more than anything Preston had said or done, was what finally moved something loose in my chest. I did not attack him. I want to be very clear about that, because the temptation to dramatize this moment into something it wasn't is strong, but the truth is both simpler and, I think, more meaningful. I stepped forward, caught his wrist as he reached to shove me again, and in one smooth motion that my body remembered even though my conscious mind had not rehearsed it in 9 years, I redirected his momentum, pivoted my hips, and brought him down onto the grass in a controlled takedown that Walt Corrigan had drilled into all of us 1,000 times over 1,000 mornings, a technique designed not to injure but to neutralize, to remove an opponent's ability to continue an assault without causing lasting harm. Preston hit the ground with a heavy, undignified thud, the wind knocked out of him, and I knelt beside him with one knee lightly pinning his shoulder, not crushing, just enough pressure to keep him still, and I said, as calmly as I could manage with my heart still slamming against my ribs, that I did not want to hurt him, that I had never wanted to hurt him, but that he was not going to touch me again in front of my daughter. The silence that followed felt like it lasted an hour, though it was probably only 10 or 15 seconds. Preston lay there, stunned, staring up at me with an expression that had shifted entirely from arrogance to something closer to confusion, the particular bewilderment of a man discovering that his assumptions about another person had been catastrophically wrong. Meredith stood frozen by her car, one hand pressed over her mouth. Junie stood on the porch, tears streaking her cheeks, and it was the sight of her, more than anything Preston might say or do, that told me exactly what needed to happen next. I released Preston, stood, and stepped back, offering him a hand up that he did not take, choosing instead to scramble to his feet on his own, brushing grass and dirt from his gray t-shirt with jerky, humiliated movements. I told him, still quietly, that I had trained in jiu-jitsu and boxing for 12 years under a man who taught me that real strength was never about proving something to another person, that I could have hurt him badly if I had wanted to, and that the only reason I hadn't was standing on that porch watching everything unfold. I told him that being a real man had nothing to do with fists and everything to do with what you protect and how carefully you protect it. I asked him to leave, and this time, he did, climbing into his black pickup truck without another word, though the tires squealed against the pavement as he pulled away, a final small tantrum from a man whose entire self-image had just been quietly dismantled in front of the woman he'd been trying to impress. What happened between Meredith and me in the minutes after Preston left was, in its own way, more significant than anything that had occurred with him. She walked toward me slowly, her face still wet with tears, and asked, in a voice smaller than I had heard from her in years, why I had never told her about any of this, about the training, about the years of discipline that lived quietly beneath the surface of the man she thought she knew completely. I told her the truth, that it had never felt important to mention, that I had built a different life on purpose, one centered on gentleness rather than the person I might have become if I had let that old intensity define me. I told her that Preston's words in the driveway, the accusation that I wasn't a real man, had actually clarified something for me rather than wounding me, because I finally understood that real manhood had never been about the thing he thought it was, the loud, aggressive, performative strength he'd built his entire identity around. It was about restraint. It was about choosing, again and again, not to use the power you have, especially when using it would be easy and even justified. Junie ran to me then, wrapping her arms around my waist, still crying, asking if I was okay, and I knelt down to her level, the way I always did when something big and frightening had happened, and told her that everyone was safe now, that sometimes grown-ups make mistakes and get scared and say things they regret, but that our job was always to protect the people we love, especially when it's hard, especially when it would be easier to let anger take over instead. She asked if I was mad at her mom, and I told her, honestly, that I was still figuring out my feelings, that some feelings take a long time to sort through, but that I would always be there to take care of her no matter what happened between her mother and me. The weeks that followed that afternoon were not simple or immediately redemptive, because real life rarely offers the tidy resolution we crave in stories. Meredith and I continued seeing Dr. Ferris, and our sessions took on a new depth after the driveway incident, because for the first time, Meredith seemed to fully grasp not just the abstract pain she had caused me, but the concrete danger her choices had nearly brought into our daughter's life. She told me, in one particularly raw session, that watching Preston shove me and watching me respond with such deliberate restraint had broken something open in her, had shown her with sudden and terrible clarity the difference between the kind of man who performs strength for an audience and the kind of man who quietly carries it without ever needing anyone to see. She said she had spent months confusing Preston's loudness for confidence, his aggression for passion, when in fact what she had walked away from was a partner who had spent his entire adult life learning how to hold enormous capability with an even greater sense of responsibility. I will not pretend that forgiveness arrived quickly or easily after that. There were nights in the months that followed when I still woke at 3 in the morning with my chest tight, replaying the sight of that black pickup truck in our driveway, still working through waves of anger and grief that no single dramatic afternoon could fully resolve. Healing, I learned, is rarely a single moment of triumph. It is closer to the discipline I had practiced for 12 years on Walt Corrigan's mats, 1,000 small repetitions, 1,000 mornings of showing up even when your body doesn't want to, gradually building something durable out of what once felt impossible. Meredith moved back home 4 months after the driveway incident, not because I decided to simply forgive and forget, but because we did the slower, harder work of rebuilding trust brick by brick, with total transparency, with hard conversations that sometimes ended in tears on both sides, with Dr. Ferris gently guiding us through the parts neither of us knew how to navigate alone. I insisted on things I never would have thought to ask for before, like Meredith switching to a different gym entirely, not out of controlling jealousy but because we both agreed that some environments simply aren't conducive to rebuilding a marriage that had nearly ended in one. She agreed without argument, understanding, finally, the weight of what she had risked. I also made changes of my own, ones I probably should have made years earlier. I started going back to a jiu-jitsu gym, not to prepare for future confrontations, but because I realized, in the aftermath of everything, how much I had lost by abandoning that part of myself for so many years, how the discipline had once been a source of genuine peace and confidence for me, not just physical capability but a kind of meditative clarity I had sorely missed during the loneliest months of our separation. I began going 3 mornings a week before work, and slowly, I felt something in myself that had gone dormant begin to wake back up, not aggression, never that, but a settled, quiet confidence that had nothing to do with proving anything to anyone else. Meredith started coming to watch occasionally, sitting on the sidelines of the gym with a cup of coffee, and one Saturday morning, months into this new routine, she told me that watching me train, watching the careful control and patience I brought to every movement, helped her understand something about who I truly was that she had somehow missed for years of marriage, buried beneath the ordinary comfortable rhythms of daily life together. I also started spending more deliberate time with Junie during this period, not because I hadn't before, but because the driveway incident had reminded me how quickly a peaceful life can be disrupted, how much I wanted her childhood to be full of the kind of memories that made her feel safe rather than frightened. We started a tradition of Saturday morning hikes at a nature preserve about 20 minutes from our house, just the two of us, talking about everything and nothing, her small hand in mine as we walked trails lined with Douglas fir and the occasional startled deer. During one of these hikes, months after everything had settled into its new, hard-won normal, Junie asked me, with the disarming directness that only children possess, whether I had been scared that day in the driveway. I told her the truth, that I had been scared, not of Preston, but of what might happen to our family, to her sense of safety, if things had gone differently. She thought about this for a while, kicking a pinecone along the trail, and then told me that she thought I was the bravest person she knew, not because I had won the fight, but because I hadn't needed to fight at all to prove I was strong. I remember having to stop walking for a moment, overwhelmed by the simple, piercing wisdom of a 9-year-old, and I told her that was one of the kindest things anyone had ever said to me. As for Preston Doyle, I heard through the grapevine of our small suburban community, the way these things always eventually surface, that he had lost his position at the gym a few months later, following what several other clients described as a pattern of overstepping boundaries with married women, a pattern that Meredith's experience had apparently not been unique to. I felt, when I heard this news, a complicated mixture of things, a flicker of vindication I am not proud of, but mostly something closer to sadness, a recognition that Preston was likely a man who had built his entire sense of worth on external validation and physical dominance because somewhere along the way, no one had ever taught him a different way to measure his own value. I did not wish him further harm. I found, somewhat to my own surprise, that I genuinely hoped he might someday find whatever it was he had been so desperately, destructively chasing in our driveway that afternoon. The rebuilding of my marriage with Meredith took the better part of a year, and I would be lying if I told you it returned to exactly what it had been before, because I don't think that's how healing works, not really. What we built instead was different, more honest, forged through a fire that had stripped away years of comfortable complacency on both our parts. We started having a standing date night again, something we had let slip away entirely during the years Junie was small and our attention was consumed by work and parenting and the slow drift of familiarity. We started actually talking at dinner instead of scrolling through our phones, a small habit that made an outsized difference in how connected we felt to one another. Meredith went back to nursing eventually, part-time at first at a local pediatric clinic, and I watched her rediscover a sense of purpose and identity that had nothing to do with anyone's validation but her own, and I made sure, deliberately and consistently, to tell her how proud I was of her, something I had let go unsaid for far too many years before all of this happened. I think often about what Preston said to me that afternoon in the driveway, the accusation that I wasn't a real man, and I have come to believe it was, in its own strange way, one of the more useful things anyone has ever said to me, not because it was true, but because it forced me to articulate, finally and clearly, what I actually believed manhood meant. It is not loudness. It is not the willingness to meet aggression with aggression. It is not even physical capability, though I won't pretend that having spent 12 years training under Walt Corrigan didn't give me a particular kind of quiet confidence that afternoon, a certainty in my own body that allowed me to remain calm rather than escalate. Real strength, I came to understand more fully than ever before, is the discipline to hold enormous capability and choose, again and again, gentleness instead. It is protecting the people you love not through domination but through steadiness, through the willingness to stay calm when everything in you wants to break, through showing your child that safety doesn't come from winning fights but from having a parent who knows exactly how to prevent them from happening in the first place. If this story has touched something in you, if you've ever been underestimated by someone who mistook your quietness for weakness, or if you've ever had to choose restraint in a moment when anger would have been so much easier, I would love to hear about it. Before we close this chapter, I want to ask you something important, something I think about often. What does being a real man, or simply a real, strong person, actually mean to you? Please leave a comment below sharing your own thoughts, because these stories become so much richer when our community adds their own wisdom and experience to them, and I read every single one. It has now been almost 2 years since that afternoon in our driveway. Junie is 11, taller than I ever expected, and has recently started taking her own jiu-jitsu classes at the same gym where I train, a development that fills me with a pride I struggle to fully put into words. Meredith and I are not the same couple we were before Preston Doyle ever walked into our lives, but in many ways, I believe we are a stronger one, tempered by a crisis we somehow found our way through together rather than letting it destroy us entirely. We still see Dr. Ferris occasionally, not because our marriage is in crisis anymore, but because we both came to value the discipline of checking in with each other honestly, the same way I check in with my own body and mind every morning on the mats. I think about Walt Corrigan often, though he passed away 3 years ago now, and I wish I could tell him that everything he taught me in that drafty gym over those 12 long years turned out to matter more than either of us probably realized at the time, that the real test was never going to happen inside a ring or on a mat, but in an ordinary driveway, on an ordinary afternoon, with my daughter watching from the porch. If this story touched your heart, please like this video, leave a meaningful comment, share it with someone who needs hope today, and subscribe to our channel so you never miss another emotional journey like this one. Our community continues to grow because of people like you, people who believe that kindness and restraint are not weaknesses but among the hardest, most important strengths a person can carry. I believe, more than ever, that the quietest people in the room are often carrying the most, and that real courage rarely announces itself the way we expect it to. It waits, patiently, until the moment it's truly needed, and then it shows up not with fists raised, but with steady hands, a calm voice, and a heart fully devoted to protecting the people who matter most. Thank you for spending this time with me and with our channel today, and I hope, wherever you are, whatever quiet battles you might be carrying, that you find the same kind of peace, forgiveness, and hard-won hope that eventually found its way back into our family.